Jason Monroe had always lived a life that seemed more like an administrative error than anything worth remembering. He was the kind of guy whose most exciting moment at work came when someone ordered an extra coffee for the office, and everyone buzzed about it like it was the new iPhone. At 38, Jason had never been what you'd call a go-getter. He wasn't lazy, per se, but he wasn't about to go chasing dreams that felt too distant or unimportant. No, Jason was the kind of guy who knew just enough to get by and spent the rest of his time online, watching dog videos or learning useless trivia. Then came the AD.IT was a slick, almost too perfect pitch that found him in a moment of weakness, sipping an uninspired instant coffee at 2 a.m., when the world seemed far away, and the screen felt like a far more interesting place to be than the lonely apartment he called home. Upload your consciousness and live forever in the cloud. You're already one step away from immortality. Don't let hesitation cost you your future. It was tempting. Even at his most skeptical, Jason found it hard to resist. What if it wasn't a scam? What if, just maybe, this was his ticket out of mediocrity? No more growing old, no more dying. A never-ending digital existence. It seemed ridiculous, of course, but then again, so did the idea of buying a toaster that could browse the web, and people had done that. He clicked the link, filled out the necessary forms, and signed away his soul, or at least, the portion of it that wasn't exactly thriving in real life. Upload complete. The message flashed on his screen like the final period at the end of a dull paragraph. Jason expected a blinding light or a wild flash of something that would signal his passage into this eternal digital dreamscape. But no. He blinked. Looked around. Everything was the same. The same crummy apartment. The same half-drunk coffee. No glowing lights, no robotic voices, no angels with harps. It was disappointing. Jason leaned back, rubbed his eyes, and then felt a strange sensation. A split second of dizziness, like stepping off the curb into a pothole. And then, nothing. No, that's not right. Everything was different. Suddenly, there was an overwhelming feeling of displacement, a jarring sense of being in two places at once. Jason's breath hitched, his heart started racing. He grabbed the sides of his chair, the fabric rough beneath his fingers. The apartment was still there, but it wasn't. The walls were starting to shimmer and bend like they were made of heat waves. Jason's first thought was that he was having a panic attack. A glitch, maybe, in his nervous system, a result of spending too much time hunched over his computer. But when he closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, everything around him felt wrong in a way that went beyond anxiety. He opened his eyes again, and then, he saw them. A man. No, a version of him. Standing in the corner of the room, dressed in an expensive suit, a gleaming grin spread across his face like he knew something Jason didn't. He had the same face, yes, but this was a different version of himself. This Jason was confident, taller, more put together. A businessman, clearly. Jason blinked and rubbed his eyes, then another version of him appeared. This one was hunched over, clearly exhausted, with bags under his eyes. A version that looked like it hadn't slept in days. A virtual manifestation of his own worst habits, overthinking, procrastination, endless cycles of self-doubt. He staggered backward, then another Jason. And another. What the hell was happening? His heart pounded as the room seemed to ripple and bend in ways that made no sense. More versions of himself appeared, some confident, some neurotic, others curious, others arrogant. They multiplied and fragmented like mirrors shattering in slow motion. Where am I? Jason gasped, but his voice felt wrong, different somehow, as though it was coming from multiple mouths. A booming voice answered, not from the room, but from everywhere. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it. You have entered the digital realm. Welcome to your consciousness. Jason felt his knees go weak, and he collapsed onto the floor, and then, as if on cue, the room around him shifted again. The walls melted into a swirling vortex of colors and lights, the digital environment warping, taking on an abstract, almost fantastical shape. Everything around him bent and stretched like some virtual carnival funhouse. Upload complete. Consciousness split. It is time to merge. Merge? What did that even mean? Jason barely had time to process the words before the world shifted again. And the next instant, Jason was no longer in his apartment. He stood in a vast, open landscape that looked like the perfect mix of a modern metropolis and a fever dream. The sky above was unnaturally blue, with geometric clouds hovering in unnatural formations. The air buzzed with an electric hum, and below, the ground stretched in endless grids, some shifting and warping like jigsaw pieces that didn't quite fit together. And then, Jason saw him again, the confident version. Jason 1, as he came to think of him. He was pacing in front of a mansion that appeared to have been constructed entirely out of gold and mirrors, a symbol of wealth and power. I knew it, Jason 1 muttered to himself, clearly not noticing Jason's approach. This is the perfect world, the one I deserve. There's no way I'm sharing it with anyone. Jason stepped forward. Hey, I think we need to talk. Jason 1 turned around, his grin widening into something almost sinister. Oh, you. The weakling version. You really think you can just waltz in here and claim this place for yourself? I don't, Jason started, but before he could finish, the world around him flickered, and he suddenly found himself back in the center of the bizarre cityscape, facing down another version of himself. This time, it was the intellectual version, Jason 2, who was absorbed in reading what looked like an endless scroll of text that stretched into infinity. Can you solve this paradox? Jason 2 asked without looking up. What? The paradox. If you are the observer, but also the observed, then what is your true identity? Jason rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of an existential question he didn't have time for. Listen, I don't need a lesson in philosophy right now. Can you just help me out here? We're kind of fractured, and I don't know how to. Before he could finish, the anxious version of himself, Jason 3, appeared, trembling, eyes wide with panic as he clutched at a map that shifted and changed with every glance. Wait. This place isn't safe. We're all going to be. Jason 3 broke off, his voice trailing into incoherent muttering as the map shimmered and transformed once again. Jason took a deep breath. This was not what he had signed up for. The task seemed impossible. How could he reunite all these fractured versions of himself? Each was so determined, so different from the others, but something inside him, something deep in his core, told him that if he didn't get it together soon, he wouldn't just lose himself, he would be consumed entirely by this digital world. And who knew what happened to a consciousness that was swallowed by the void? This was not the immortality he had imagined, and yet, somehow, Jason couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a desperate laugh, but the kind of laugh someone gives when they realize the joke's on them, and there's no way out. Jason couldn't help but laugh. It was a strange sound, echoing through the warped and shifting landscape, but it felt like the only honest thing to do in that moment. He had no idea what was happening, no idea how to fix it, but he did know one thing: if he didn't get a handle on it soon, he might never leave this place. That he looked around at his fractured selves, each one so wildly different from the other. There was no unity, no cohesion. They were splintered parts of himself, and all of them seemed more intent on asserting their independence than working together. Jason took another deep breath and tried to shake off the feeling that he was losing control. He was supposed to be in charge of this situation. He was supposed to be himself, but how could he when there were so many of him? I don't know how to merge us, Jason muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But I have to. I have to bring us back together. Jason 1, arrogant, confident, the businessman version, was still striding across his golden mansion grounds. He was looking down at Jason with an amused smirk, as if all this was just a game to him. Jason stepped forward, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. Look, I'm not here to take your mansion, okay? I just need your help. All of us need to come together. We're scattered. I'm scattered. Jason's words hung in the air, but Jason 1 merely chuckled. You're weak, you know that. Jason 1 sneered, as if it were obvious. "You're here, but you don't deserve this. You don't deserve me. You don't deserve to control anything. I'm the one who's got everything figured out. I'm the one who will lead." Jason felt a familiar pang of frustration and self-doubt. It was a feeling he had known well over the years, but now it was amplified, almost suffocating. How could he get through to this part of himself, the arrogant, overbearing version of himself that was always trying to prove something to the world? But the longer Jason stared at his business-savvy counterpart, the more he realized something. Jason 1 wasn't a separate person at all. He was a reflection of the parts of Jason that had always believed that success was the only way to prove worth. It was the version of him that had tried to climb the corporate ladder and failed, then pushed harder, then burned out. And now, in this digital world, it had manifested into something bigger and more confident. Jason 1 wasn't truly powerful, he was just a version of himself that had buried all his insecurities under layers of wealth and bravado. Jason didn't want that. He wanted to be whole, to integrate everything he had learned, both the failure and the success, into something that made sense. He didn't need to be this. "You're right," Jason said suddenly, surprising himself. "You've got it all figured out, huh? But it's not real. You're not real." Jason 1 paused for a moment, his confident smile faltering just slightly. "What do you mean?" Jason stepped forward, locking eyes with his other self. "This place, none of this matters. The mansion, the money, it's all fake. It's all just a mask." Jason 1's face twisted with something like anger, and he took a threatening step forward. But Jason didn't back down. He knew this was the only way to deal with it. He couldn't fight with bravado, he had to meet it with clarity. "You don't control me. I'm not here for your version of success. I'm here to make us whole." Jason 1 paused, then, with a defeated sigh, turned away. "Fine, do whatever you want," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But you'll never be like me. You'll never be this." Jason didn't reply. Instead, he turned and began walking away, toward the next fractured version of himself. As he moved through the shifting digital space, Jason could see it all, each of his versions waiting for him, like scattered pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. There was Jason 2, the intellectual version, still lost in the never-ending scroll of knowledge. There was Jason 3, the anxious one, still trembling as he calculated the probabilities of what would happen next. Each version of Jason represented something true, something he couldn't deny. He had been arrogant at times, yes. He had been intellectual. And he had been afraid. But those pieces were just parts of him. They weren't the whole picture. Jason stepped toward the intellectual Jason, who barely seemed to notice him approach. The virtual landscape around him was filled with layers of abstract data, floating symbols and equations. Jason 2 was lost in a sea of thoughts, absorbed by the endless analysis. He looked up briefly as Jason drew near, his expression full of indifference. "You again?" Jason 2 asked, his voice laced with irritation. "I'm trying to solve something here. Can't you see? Everything is interconnected. It's all just data. I'm trying to solve it, understand it." "Right," Jason said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Look, I get it. I know you think you're the smart one here, but we can't solve everything by thinking. I need you to come with me. We all have to come together. We're too fractured right now." Jason 2 looked at him, eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand. If you can't solve the problem, the paradox, I can't help you. We all need to be logical. The pieces are incomplete, and we cannot, will not, merge until we understand the framework." Jason shook his head. "You're missing the point. This place isn't about logic. It's about us. All of us. I can't be the one who holds it all together by myself. I need you, and I need to understand what's real and what isn't. We're not going to solve this with just knowledge." For a moment, it looked like Jason 2 might argue, but then something flickered in his eyes, something that looked a lot like realization. He dropped the scroll and nodded slowly. "Fine. I'll go with you." Jason breathed a sigh of relief. 1 down, 2 to go. As Jason walked deeper into the digital world, he came upon Jason 3, the anxious version, who was still frantically examining a holographic map, his hands shaking. "It's not going to work. It's not going to work." Jason 3 muttered, panic rising in his voice. "Everything is falling apart. I can't. Hey, Jason said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "You've got to stop. We've got to fix this. All of us together." Jason 3's trembling eyes met his. "But what if we're wrong? What if it's too late?" Jason's heart ached. He understood the fear. It was the same fear that had paralyzed him for years, the paralyzing doubt that kept him from moving forward. It was the fear of never being enough, of not getting it right, of losing control. "You're not alone," Jason said softly. "None of us are. We're stronger together, even when it feels impossible." There was a long silence, but then, slowly, Jason 3 nodded, his anxiety still present but subdued. "Okay. I'll help." With that, all 3 versions of Jason stood together, a fractured, incomplete version of the man he was, but a version that was at least trying to heal. But Jason knew this wasn't over. The world around him was still shifting, still pulling at the seams of his identity. The longer he stayed here, the more the digital landscape pushed back. There was a force at play, an intelligence that was watching, waiting for him to fail. "We need to find the heart of this place," Jason said, his voice steady now. "That's the only way we can come together. We need to find the center." And together, the 3 of them walked into the unknown. The landscape around them warped again, as though the digital world itself was watching them, shifting, bending, warping under the weight of their decisions. It was as if the world was trying to hold them apart, forcing them to remain fractured, like puzzle pieces that could never fit. But Jason wasn't about to give up. Not now. He could feel the pull of something deeper, something more powerful at the core of this place. If he could just reach it, he knew it would all make sense. The 3 versions of himself, Jason 1, Jason 2, and Jason 3, walked together in uneasy silence, navigating through a cityscape that seemed to stretch endlessly. The ground beneath their feet flickered with neon gridlines that made everything look artificial, like they were stepping on a giant virtual screen. The buildings around them were sleek and futuristic, their edges too sharp, their windows reflecting nothing but an emptiness. It was a place of potential, but also a place of distortion, where nothing felt truly real. Jason glanced over at Jason 1, who was still walking with his chest puffed out, a smug grin plastered across his face. Even now, with the world collapsing around them, he still felt like the embodiment of success. Jason 2 was quieter, deep in thought, scanning the surroundings with a calculating gaze, while Jason 3 muttered to himself, looking like he wanted to sprint off into the distance, away from the unease that clung to the air. But for the first time, Jason could see the cracks in them all, the armor of confidence, the cold intellect, the paralyzing fear. It was all a cover for something deeper. Something they all shared. "I know what this is," Jason said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. The others turned to look at him. "This is a test. We've been split, torn apart, because we're not supposed to be just one version of ourselves. We're supposed to integrate. We can't escape this place until we understand that. All of us, together." Jason 1 raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And you think you've got it all figured out now?" Jason ignored the sarcasm, continuing. "We're not going to get anywhere by fighting each other. We need to merge the best parts of ourselves. The confidence, the intellect, the caution. Together, they make us whole. We've been running from ourselves, thinking that if we split into enough pieces, we wouldn't have to face the truth. But that's what this place is trying to teach us. We have to accept all of it." Jason 2, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp. "You're right. All of us are just different facets of the same person. And right now, we're too fragmented to see the bigger picture. But how do we fix it? How do we put the pieces back together?" Jason glanced at the shifting skyline ahead of them. The air shimmered, a digital mirage, like the entire world was made of smoke and mirrors. But somewhere beyond the distortion, he felt it, a presence. "A pulse." "We go to the heart of this place," Jason said, more confidently this time. "The center. If we can find it, we can reunite everything." "I know it." Jason once scoffed. "And what makes you so sure? You're just making things up as you go along." "I'm sure," Jason replied, his voice steady. "Because this place was made for us. All of us. We're not the first ones to go through this. There's something at the center of this digital world, something that holds it all together. And if we can find it, we can fix ourselves." Jason 3, who had been pacing nervously, stopped. His wide eyes were filled with doubt, but also something else, something more fragile, like the beginnings of hope. "But what if we can't? What if it's too late?" Jason turned to him, locking eyes. "We can do it. We can. You're not alone anymore." The three of them exchanged looks. The world around them seemed to pause, almost as if it were waiting for them to decide. The pulse Jason had sensed earlier grew louder, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was both a call and a challenge, and Jason felt it deep in his chest. This was it. This was where everything would change. Without another word, they began to move forward, the ground beneath their feet humming with energy, the air thick with static. Every step felt like it brought them closer to something important, something vital. But at the same time, it felt like the world was closing in on them. The lights in the sky flickered, casting erratic shadows. The buildings around them distorted, bending at impossible angles. And the pulse grew louder, now almost deafening, vibrating through the very fabric of the digital world. Jason's heart raced, his pulse matching the rhythm of the world around him. He had no idea what would happen when they reached the center, but he knew they couldn't stop. They couldn't go back. Finally, they reached it. At the heart of the city, in the center of everything, stood a massive structure, tall and sleek, its surface reflecting the chaos around it like a mirror. It wasn't just a building, it was a gateway. Jason could feel it, could sense the hum of energy emanating from it. This was where everything converged. This was the core. Jason stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is it," he said, barely above a whisper. "We have to go in." Jason 1 crossed his arms. "You really think we can fix it just by walking through some shiny door?" Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what was waiting for them inside. This wasn't just about the digital world. It was about all of them. It was about coming to terms with every part of who they were, accepting all the versions of themselves that had been torn apart. He took a deep breath and stepped into the structure. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world shifted, the landscape around them melted away like water running through their fingers. Jason felt his body stretch, morphing into something more, whole. He didn't feel like just one version of himself anymore. He felt like all of them, all at once. Every memory, every decision, every mistake, it was all there, in vivid detail. He could see the arrogance of Jason 1, the sharp intellect of Jason 2, the overwhelming fear of Jason 3, and the quiet parts of himself that he'd buried beneath all those layers. He felt them all. For the first time in his life, Jason didn't feel like he had to run from himself. He didn't have to push the parts of him away that he hated. The truth was, every version of himself had a place in the world. And if he could accept them all, maybe, just maybe, he could fix everything. Behind him, he could hear the others stepping in, their voices lost in the hum of energy that surrounded them. "This is it," Jason said again, his voice steady, almost in awe. "We're whole again." The center of the structure pulsed with light, wrapping around them like a cocoon. Jason closed his eyes, and in that moment, he understood. It wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about accepting that they were never broken in the first place. They were all part of the same person, different, but the same. And once he accepted that, everything else would fall into place. The light around them intensified, and Jason felt a sudden pull, like being drawn upward. There was a flash, a moment of pure, blinding energy, and then everything went still. When Jason opened his eyes again, he was back in the apartment. The dull walls, the half-empty coffee cup, the quiet hum of the city outside, it was all the same. But something had changed. Jason felt whole. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could breathe. Like he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He looked at the clock. The time hadn't changed. Nothing had changed, except for him, and that, Jason realized, was the point. It wasn't about escaping reality. It was about accepting it. All of it. He smiled, a little to himself, as he sat back in his chair. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace.